What's going on, guys? This is Empty Box, and let's talk about a forgotten game to a degree, a response to Gran Turismo, and in a way, the forerunner of Forza if you squint really hard from a good 30 feet away. That game, Sega GT. So let's go ahead and set the stage for this game with a short little history lesson just so that way everyone is up to speed. The story really begins about 10 years before this game even came out, back in the early 90s. Sega's locked in a battle to the death with Nintendo, doing what Nintendo don't, bringing in their blast processing in the battle for home console supremacy. It's a two-horse race and has been a two-horse race for a long while. Sonic, at the time, was a pretty big deal. On the arcade side of things, Sega was absolutely at their peak in this era. In particular, relevant to this story, the racing games, which I will talk about every opportunity that I get the chance to. They were absolutely on the top of their game in this era. And Sega, more or less, was just synonymous with speedy things because, the Sega racing games, Sonic being, really fast, kind of a thing that they had. I think they kind of had a bit of a reputation in that sense. This would go ahead and change when you get into the mid-90s, specifically 1995 when the Sony PlayStation releases, which was a bit of a problem for old Sega. While Nintendo had certainly a worthy competitor in the N64 and their first-party games and what they could do because they were Nintendo, Sega wasn't so lucky and would largely flop around for a few years trying to make a viable competitor that never really got any traction. This is how you get to 1999 or 2000s, depending on the market, the Sega Dreamcast. A moonshot Hail Mary attempt to win back ever-growing console home market, Sega attempting to hole-shot the 6th generation console market a year and a bit early. So that's the hardware side of things. However, the Sega GT backstory and what this game was supposed to be and how things happened, more or less, isn't complete without talking about Gran Turismo, of course. You most likely know the gameplay and the history, and Gran Turismo was a really big deal that spawned off all these Gran Turismo clones like Sega GT and Forza and all these other series that popped up all of a sudden and out of nowhere. And it's a Sega GT video, so I'm not going to go into great detail on why that is, except for one little point. The best-selling game on the PlayStation 1 is Gran Turismo. I didn't even realize this until actually looking it up for this video. I knew it was a big deal, and I know it sold like a bajillion copies, but I thought, must be top 10, top 5, surely, it's a racing game after all. But no, it's number 1 with about 11 million copies sold. For a little bit of a more modern perspective and to kind of talk about the impact of Gran Turismo and just how massive it was, there was about 15 million more PlayStation 4 consoles sold than PlayStation 1s. The PS4's leading Gran Turismo Sport, sold 8 million copies, despite 15 million more consoles out in the market. So if you are Sega, yeah, the Gran Turismo concept is a solid winner that'll sell systems and had proven a great success. And yoink, so the Gran Turismo not-so-secret formula was stolen. This isn't to say that Sega 100% was going into this expecting that it would just be that simple and they'd get Gran Turismo levels of success and sell a bunch of Dreamcasts, but I think it's fair to say they certainly hoped, especially with their reputation for awesome racing games. In addition to the Dreamcast release, this game would also release onto PCs about a year or so after the console launch, which actually is where my experience with this game comes from back in the day. And this was a little bit of a fairly big deal at the time because there was nothing like Gran Turismo available on the PCs. It just simply wasn't the type of racing game that you would see on the PC at the time. So that's enough of the backstory. Let's go ahead and actually start talking about the game and what it is, what it does well, what it doesn't, its wins and its fails, and let's begin. A key part of the formula for a game like this is raw car count. Sega GT did relatively fine when viewed from the prism of Gran Turismo 1, with about 130 some odd cars, and a somewhat similar-ish variety as well. There's a bunch of skylines here, let's put it that way. This game falls in that same trap that Gran Turismo did, although I don't think it falls quite as hard, or at least quite as ridiculous as things would eventually get with Gran Turismo. In addition to the normal cars that you would expect, you can also go ahead and make your own car, choosing your own preset different engine types, drivetrain layouts and bodies, as well as the headlights and all that stuff. It's actually a pretty cool concept to see in this game, considering when this game did come out, although I always thought it was kind of a little bit half-baked, underdone, and didn't really live up to the potential that the feature had. The biggest deviation from the Gran Turismo formula of the time is the fact that cars are sorted into classes, with Class E, B, A, SA, as well as beyond that you have standard cars, which are the regular cars, original cars, which are the cars that you create in the car builder, and works cars, which are full-blown race cars we'll talk about in a moment. This is actually a pretty decent deviation from the main Gran Turismo type formula, because it no longer enables you to steamroller the game in the same way that you can in Gran Turismo of the time, where they just didn't care about any sort of restrictions that it seemed like they were trying to place. I mean, this is the time where Gran Turismo 2, the yellow GT40, as well as just the fact that the horsepower rating's just so ridiculous and didn't really mean anything to Gran Turismo 2, and Gran Turismo 1 just didn't even care and didn't even make an effort to try and balance things. This game actually forces you to use different cars, which is very nice to see. As you'd probably expect in a game like this, there are license tests. And to drive the faster class cars, you do need to pass a license test first. However, it works a good bit differently than Gran Turismo, and it's actually a pretty neat little system. First off, every license will have multiple different manufacturers that you can take that license test with. If you were a Daihatsu guy, you get to pick the Daihatsu license test. If you're the Honda guy, you can take the Mugen license test. If you're a Toyota guy, you can go to TRD and do all that stuff. You don't need to buy the car, it doesn't matter. You get to represent whatever brand that you like, which is cool. Licenses, well, to get a license in this game is really actually a cakewalk. There's no challenge at all here. You just have to beat a lap time around a short little circuit, and you'll pretty much easily do it without too much of an issue. You can go off track, you can bounce off of walls. The lap times are very easy to attain, so it's pretty much a cakewalk to get the highest class license level within like 5 minutes of gameplay. It's trivial. However, if you want a bit more of a challenge, and you're probably going to want a bit more of a challenge, you can go to set the fastest lap time. This would be like the equivalent of going for the gold licenses in Gran Turismo. There's a lap time that's actually somewhat a little bit more challenging to go ahead and attain. However, beating that comes with a great reward in that it enables you to enter the works race for that manufacturer. If you win that works race, you get a free race car right off the bat. And one of the neat little things with this system is you have to enter the works race with the brand that you took the license test with. If you want to go ahead and enter in another works race with one of the different manufacturers, you have to take that license test back with that manufacturer, beat the fastest lap time there, and then enter in the works race for that manufacturer. Which, this whole thing, it might sound really convoluted, but given that it really takes just a matter of minutes, it's a fun way to kind of create a little bit of brand loyalty and allow players to choose a little bit of their own adventure, if you will. I really actually like this system, and it's a shame that, as far as I'm aware, there's no real racing games, especially in this type of category, that have really done anything remotely similar since. And coming back and playing this game now all these years later, I remembered this system and how fun it could be and how, in a way, overpowered, because after all, you can go from 0 to your JGTC dream car in like 15 minutes. Now, because of the structure of the game and the fact that they do actually force you to use multiple different cars and you can't just steamroller everything with an Escudo, you're still going to have to drive different cars. However, it's really cool that it gives you that freedom to just basically make a beeline to whatever late 90s, Japanese race car, poster material you would like. And especially if you go ahead and chase down some of the higher class works cars that you get for free, prize money will flow really easily because you can go back and complete a bunch of events with those cars. Especially, if you get the SA class works cars, you can compete in big money events right from the drop and right from the go. Also, a neat flavor to the prize money structure is prize money in the form of sponsorship, where winning certain events will grant you a bonus prize from the quote-unquote sponsors in future events, which is a nice way of upping those rewards and keeping that steamroller rolling and getting the snowball bigger. It's just a neat little feature that is underutilized in games today. All in all, this game is structurally very much in the Gran Turismo formula. However, in many ways, it still deviates from Gran Turismo of the time, and it's unique enough that it does have its own merits to it. That's the good part of the game, though. You might have noticed I haven't talked about driving at all yet, because it sucks. Driving in this game is actually frustrating in ways that few games can claim. You know when people call something simcade? This is what I always think of when people say simcade. It can't decide if it wants to be simulation oriented or arcade oriented, and it just kind of sucks because it doesn't do anything well. Going around corners in this game, it's like inertia need not apply and every car has the stickiest slicks ever conceived, while simultaneously having zero grip should you dare push it just a little bit too far. The brakes are also what I like to refer to as Forza brakes, where they work, but are stupidly easy to lock up without any warning, and once you do lock them up, they're going to stay locked up for days and you're just totally hosed at that point. There's nothing you can do. The slower cars are fine enough, but going up the ladder, it becomes an ever bigger and bigger issue. For example, the Castro Mugen NSX works car I made a beeline to feels like it's a Lotus Elise coupled with a 1500 horsepower V8 drag motor shoved in the back while having zero rear downforce but all of the front downforce. It's just really weird, and changing settings doesn't fix this issue. I remember even back in the day playing on PC with my trusty non-force feedback Microsoft Sidewinder, this game was a mess to drive. There are no traction control or stability control options, which was very typical at the time. Normally I would say turn them off because who needs them, and plus with most games, it just makes things more difficult to drive in a way because the car's fighting against you, but this is the rare exception where the game would have actually probably have been better with traction control, with anti-lock brakes, with stability control, just to help take the edge off of things and make the driving model actually make something resembling any sort of sense. Now, because it's from this era, cars chonk over the low poly road surface like crazy. This is also a very big issue in Gran Turismo 2 in particular, but holy moly is it a problem here, which when you combine that with the way cars in general handle to begin with, it just piles up into a not great experience. Then you add in the fact that it's way easier to just pull a Chastain and bounce off of the wall, and it's just terrible driving. And if there's one thing that's really, really hard to overcome in a game like this, it's terrible handling, and for no good reason. I'm sure some people will say, oh, well, these games from back in the day were always kind of a little bit goofy to control anyways because they're trying to do, more quote-unquote simulation side of things, but the controllers were limited. Like, no, this game actually has a really good control layout, and it's actually modern. It's basically controls just like the Forza games. The problem is the physics can't make their mind up on what in the world they're trying to do, which is really bizarre when you consider the fact that Sega was really good and really on their game when it came to racing games. I don't know if they decided that they wanted this to try and kind of handle a little bit more familiar to the arcade style games, but it doesn't feel like an arcade style game. But it also doesn't feel like a simulation game. It feels like an identity crisis, and that's all I can think of when I think about Sega GT, is the fact that it didn't know what in the world that it wanted to be. But it does get better, right? Well, the tracks really kinda suck, surprisingly. This is another case of Sega GT's inability to pick a lane and decide what in the world it was actually going to be. Sega racing games in the arcade at the time were legendary, and it's not like they forgot how to make it. Crazy Taxi was going on at the time. It was great. But the typical Sega arcade racer had really wild, over-the-top tracks set in very unique and identifiable environments. That did carry on into Sega GT, however, not so much in a great way. On the plus side, I always remembered the snowy circuit, the old West Town, and the one with the satellite dishes I always thought was Area 51, despite very obviously not being so. But the track layouts, not a clue. and coming back to this game, they didn't feel familiar at all. The environments did. I remembered the environments, but tracks, no. In the effort to make every circuit visually distinct, they forgot to make actually interesting circuits to drive on, which meant that basically every single track falls into the category of the mid-speed sweeper buffet and feeling incredibly samey despite the fact that all the environments are entirely different. It just all blends together into one pile of bleh. Overall, Sega GT is a game that should have been better. Arguably, it needed to be better. No, I think factually, it needed to be better. Falling just a few months after Gran Turismo 2, it may have looked like a step forward visually, but GT2 also had over 600 cars, and then Gran Turismo 3, just a few months later, looked like a step way beyond this, as well as actually a much better game to play. Now, while this game was a failure, I do think it leaves something of a legacy behind, and it should be remembered, hence this video. When Sega ended up washing out of the console hardware market with the failure of the Dreamcast, the titles that Sega's developed ended up elsewhere. In this case, the follow-up to this game, Sega GT 2002, ended up becoming the big racing game flagship for Microsoft's Xbox early on in its life. I've never played that game, as I was on the PlayStation 2 side of things and no PC port was released back in the day, so I can't comment on that game other than saying I remember seeing the ad in AutoWeek back in the day and it certainly looked cool. Yeah, I'm that old. I remember magazine ads for video games in car magazines. It also apparently doesn't run at all, basically, on emulators, so I can't really comment on that at all either. So tell me, for those of you guys who did play that game, get wild down in that comment section. Tell me all about Sega GT 2002. Was I missing out? Is it a great game? Is it a gem? Is it a diamond in the rough? What were we all missing? Now, eventually what would happen, as basically everyone knows, Microsoft would take over and make their own Gran Turismo competitor in Forza Motorsport and finally give us a flagship title worthy adversary for Gran Turismo that we've awaited since basically 1998. And I don't think it's surprising that Forza carried forward several of the structural changes that Sega GT brought to the formula for games like this. The concepts like sponsorship or brand affinity, not having 175 Skylines or Miatas, MX-5 Roadsters, whatever they're called in your area, abolishing the tyranny of the license test, and most importantly, having car classes and structure to the gameplay, which is something Gran Turismo avoided like the plague until alarmingly recently. So pour one out for Sega GT, a failed game that couldn't deliver on the hopes of being a Gran Turismo level success, but took the puncher's chance and gave it a go anyways. So with that, if you're still here, let me know what you guys think about these types of videos, as I'm working towards doing more of these more regularly, and don't hesitate to offer suggestions for games to talk about, because it's always fun to talk about somewhat forgotten racing games, especially from this era, because I just love them that much. So anyways, hope you guys enjoyed. Bye.